everyone. Good evening. It's so great to be here in Biscayne, and I love Biscayne. I rarely come here, but anyway, I just want to make a quick introduction. My name is Maki Burgess, and I work at the University of Miami for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, which we actually go by OLLI because it's easier than going Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And sometimes on the phone when people call me, I'm like, OLLI? Your name is OLLI? No, it's OLLI. Anyway, it's great to be here. And also, if you don't know who we are on the main campus of the University of Miami in Coral Gables. I don't know if some of you I know are OLLI members, which is great, and some of you who are OLLI member, like Christine, who's standing on the left. And actually, thanks to her, we now have a relationship with the Biscayne Community Center. And last week, we actually we brought one of our most popular instructor by the name of Dr. Mitra Raheb. She's very popular for her hot topic, global viewpoint, and she always pack the classrooms. It's always packed. We have wait lists, and it's like completely crazy. But anyway, so she was here last week, last Tuesday, actually last Wednesday morning. And the room was also very packed, and I'm glad to hear that we had great feedback, and it was very successful. And tonight, I have the pleasure to introduce you to another popular instructor, Mr. Armando Droulers, who is actually an art history instructor, an artist, and an educator. So I have the pleasure. I'm going to hand off the mic to him, and I have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you. And welcome, everybody. We're going to speak about Gustav Klimt, the great Austrian artist. I have a lot of images, so some of them I'll go fast, some of them slower. My mother told me when I come to a lecture, first of all, never bring liquor to the table, to wear a blazer, which I forgot to wear. And she said, try not to speak about sex and politics. It's going to be a little bit hard with Gustav Klimt, the sex part. I'll try to keep the politics on the low side. We have three major 20th century artists that are probably the most famous of them. Gustav Klimt came first, and then we had Egon Schiele, whom we lost at a very young age, at the tender age of 28. And then we have Oskar Kokoschka. Those are the three great Viennese modernists, the Austrians. It's funny because Egon Schiele died in 1918, so did Gustav Klimt, although Gustav was a lot older. And I believe Franz Joseph, the former head of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, emperor and king, also died that same year, as did the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It ceased to exist after the First World War, and Austria became this tiny little country. Great country, though, great wines, but and great art. So anyways, that being said, because it is the 100th anniversary next year, they have these big exhibitions around major museums around the world commemorating these great artists. And it's kind of funny because this morning I saw ads, I believe it was in the London Underground, for Egon Schiele. And Egon Schiele's art is sexually charged, it's very erotic. And so they put the posters on the subway, on the underground, as they say in England, and they covered the private parts and certain parts of the paintings with a label that says when the show is going to be. So there was an article in the New York Times talking about, imagine if this is happening now in 2017, imagine what it was like in the conservative times of Franz Joseph, because this, it was one of the most conservative empires on the face of the earth. Okay, and so that was a very big battle that Gustav Klimt and the modernist paintings had to fight because their paintings were not accepted. Hard to believe because now everybody loves Gustav Klimt. But anyways, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a huge empire. You can see it there in the middle, Austro-Hungary. And he was Emperor Franz Joseph, was the Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, Croatia, and Bohemia. And it was a problem because it was a country that became too big. It was very sick at the time. That's why it ceased to exist in the First World War. And it was kind of a contradiction because it was so conservative on the one hand, but on the other hand, in Vienna, you had a very a cultural elite that was very advanced. In medicine, for example, we had Sigmund Freud, who was coming up with these new notions that everybody thought they were crazy, but in the end, we all know Sigmund Freud and the such. So these two worlds were living side by side, a world that wanted to break the chains from conservatism, and then the other side that wanted to break into modernism. And so Gustav Klimt probably exemplifies the artist that fought this battle in many different arenas during his life. Why? Because he became the favorite from a very young age of Franz Joseph. And then Franz Joseph, in the end, he could not stand him because he could not stand his art. Speaking about Franz Joseph, it was very hard to keep this big country together because they spoke several languages, at least 9 full-fledged languages, not to talk about different dialects, different religions, and everything. On top of that, they had annexed Bosnia, and the Bosnians are Slavs. And the Serbs and the rest of the Slavic countries, such as Russia, they were not happy that they were annexing these guys. And on top of that, they did not have all the rights of like a Viennese or an Austrian resident. So they were part of the country, but they really weren't. And there were all these separatist groups that wanted independence for Bosnia from the empire. Franz Joseph, His Imperial and Apostolic Majesty, by the grace of God, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, and Bohemia. 2 crowns. And he was very lucky. He, you know, in Europe, you got married. They were all arranged so that we could keep the power in the family. And he was supposed to marry his cousin, but he didn't like her, but he liked the sister. And the sister happened to be, we call her Sisi. If you remember the movie, my girlfriend, what was her name? Romy Schneider was Sisi in the old movie. And Sisi was one of the most beautiful women of Europe. Not only was she one of the most beautiful women of Europe, but she was very photographed. Photography was a nascent art form, but it was already on the scene. And so a lot of people knew who she was. If she had been alive today, she'd be like Princess Diana. She'd be on the cover of People and Hola and all those things. They had 3 girls and 1 boy. The crowns would only be inherited by the man. Sorry, ladies. And Gustav Rudolf, was the inheritor of the crown. He was a man that was very different from his father. He hated the pompousness of the court. It was a very strict court. He wanted to progress. His father didn't think much of him because he wanted him to just fit into that machine. And unfortunately, he committed suicide with his mistress in the hunting lodge, his favorite hunting lodge, Mayerling. And so the problem was that this empire now has no heir. Franz Ferdinand had a couple of brothers. Let me go to the next one, see if there is Sisi. I've been speaking about her and forgot to put the slide. But Sisi got killed. I visited a villa in Corfu in Greece. She had a villa there. It was not really a great marriage. She preferred to be outside of Austria. She preferred to be outside the court. So she built herself a beautiful villa in the island of Corfu in Greece. And she traveled a lot. She was often sick. And she went to Lake Geneva. She was staying in a hotel. There was an Italian anarchist that recognized her from the photographs, and he had actually said that day to kill a man from France, the Duke of Orleans, But he saw Sissy and he thought, oh, this is even better. And he stabbed her, not even with a knife, with a little, kind of like a slab, like an iron thing. And she didn't notice it because she had the, how do you call that, the corset. She boarded a ferry, she felt bad, and in the end she died in the hotel in Geneva. So here we have no air, Sissy dies, and the younger brother of Franz Joseph had been sent to Mexico to be emperor of Mexico, of all places. And and he ended up getting shot by the Mexican rebels. And so he had a nephew, his name was Franz Ferdinand, and Franz Ferdinand was supposed to take over the throne. If you remember, Franz Ferdinand got killed in Sarajevo. He was doing public duties before assuming the role of emperor, and he gets killed in Sarajevo by the Serbian Bosnian separatists. And this is what will start and spark World War I. Now, Franz Joseph, there we have Sissy, there we have the fellow that killed her, and there's a little illustration of her by Lake Geneva. I think the hotel name is called L'Hotel Bellevue. And there we have Franz Joseph with Franz Ferdinand. And Franz Ferdinand was being trained for the job, and so he went to Sarajevo. I don't remember exactly, he went to inaugurate a hospital, things that heads of states do. And these separatists managed to kill him and his wife. So Franz Joseph was very, very upset. Of course, he threatened the Serbians. He gave them all these ultimatums. The Serbians accepted almost all of them, except the one where it said that Gavrilo Princip was to be tried by the Serbians. And so he took that as an excuse to intimidate them. Of course, for him, Serbia was this tiny little country. He moved the troops. You know how war starts. You don't know who shot the first shot. But there were these, Russia was on the side of the Serbs and the Bosnians because they're Slavs. And the Slavs always help each other. Very important. And so there we have Franz Ferdinand. On one side we have when he got killed, and on the other side we have him with his family. He got killed, like I said, with his wife. And the war starts in August of that year. We call it the Guns of August in art historical terms, in the summer of 1914. And this is pretty much a diagram of what was going on. The pacts were already set with the years. You can see it there. Austria-Hungary, Germany, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, which was huge, and Italy. And on the other sides, Britain, France, and Russia had made a pact, and so they will fight against and Serbia, of course, defending little Serbia. And so that is the beginning of the war. Terrible. More than 70 million military personnel were mobilized. More than 60 million fought. About 9 million got killed, without talking about the ones that were wounded and all that. So it was just a little bit of history, so that this is the world that these guys in Vienna are living in. It is the end. It's going to be the end of the empire. Gustav Klimt doesn't quite get there because he dies in 1914, and he will die at the tender age of 56. Egon Schiele, whom I had mentioned, died at the age of 28. And they both died kind of for the same reason. The Spanish influenza, this influenza virus, got Europe. He was born the son of an engraver, a man who had a very difficult time to maintain his family. They were quite poor, and so it was important that him and his brother and his younger brother would go and study art so that they could maintain the family. Now, my father would say, how can you maintain a family with art? But they managed to do it, and they managed to do it quite well. So they go to the Applied Arts of the Austrian Museum of Art and Industry, and his brother Ernst, him, and a friend called Franz Mack, they will found a company which will specialize itself in painting for architectural buildings, okay, for architecture. And they were actually quite lucky because Vienna was in full transition, okay? Franz Joseph, even though he was very conservative, he was a very smart man in this sense. He decided to turn Vienna into the beautiful city that it is today. He decided to take away the walls, the medieval walls of Vienna. He decided to open up its boulevards, the Ringstrasse. He decided to build all these new buildings, the parliament, the theater, new museums, the Kunsthistorisches Museums, two of them, one for natural history and one for the Habsburg collection, all in one place, and so forth. So these guys were very lucky, because all of a sudden they're starting out their careers and there's a lot of jobs for painting the inside of new buildings. Actually, Paris is the city that it is today, with its wide boulevards and its parks and all that, thanks to Napoleon III, who was the Emperor of France back then in the 50s, because he told Baron Haussmann, the guy who was doing all the building for him, look at Vienna and do to Paris what Franz Joseph did with Vienna. And so we owe it kind of to the Viennese also, this beautiful city of Paris. Now, the French are going to hate me for saying that, but anyways, the Berg Theater. This is the new Berg Theater. It looks old to you, but it wasn't built when Klimt is graduating. And so they get a job. The first job is to decorate the main staircase, the central staircase of the new Berg Theater. They drew sticks to see what they would paint, and Klimt, he gets the altar of Dionysus, the theater of Taormina, the altar of Apollo, the Thespian cart, and the Globe Theatre of Shakespeare in London. Very classical and very traditional subject matters. There is a picture of the Berg Theater and the Ringstrasse as it looked when it was finished. So good for Franz Joseph on that one. And there is the main staircase of the Berg Theater. I just did a tour of Vienna this summer, and they have a restaurant in this theater. It's kind of expensive, but it's beautiful. It's worth it to go there at night and eat there. But anyways, in the Berg Theater, he will do these very classical paintings. I mean, there is the Thespian cart. Thespis of Icaria was, according to theater people, the first one to take it from a chorus and invent a second character and put masks, and then he toured with this theater. And he was very famous. We know about him from Aristotle, who wrote about him. He does this very classical, we see there the Thespian cart. He does the theater of Taormina. This one is the altar of Dionysus, very classical also. Dionysus, the god of wine, my god. And then those of you that have been to Sicily, you've probably been to Taormina. You remember this one? How can you forget, right? The view is gorgeous. And this is a great theater because it is the only Greco-Roman theater, because it was first a Greek theater and then the Romans built it. And how we know it's Romans is it has the backstage of it. It's still up. The Greeks, they didn't like to put stuff on the back. The stage was open. And then, of course, the beautiful view there. So that's the theater in Taormina. And there is Klimt, who does his version of the theater of Taormina, how he thought it looked during the time of the Greeks. We see Nike, the goddess of victory, with the olive wreath of victory holding out. So I just wanted to show you Klimt, the classical Klimt. Very classical indeed. For quite a few years, very young. You can see his talent. There we see the painting on the right-hand side on the main staircase. And the emperor, he was so happy with this that he will give Klimt the Emperor's Prize in 1890. So here's a very young Klimt, just getting started in his career, and Franz Joseph, one of the most important leaders in the world, is giving him the Emperor's Prize. And of course, from that came other commissions. Now, Franz Joseph says to Klimt, I want to give you a nice commission. I would like to have a painting of the old Berg Theater, because the old Berg Theater is going to get torn down. And Klimt, instead of painting the Emperor, a painting of the Berg Theater on the outside, he paints Franz Joseph in his balcony with Sissi. And it is said that everybody in his court could recognize themselves in this painting. So here is this is very hard to do, believe me. And so, of course, he's riding high with the emperor, he's riding high with everything. One of the buildings that they built also towards the end of the century by Franz Joseph was the Kunsthistorisches Museum. It was done in a kind of a Renaissance, Italian Renaissance style. It was very criticized by the modernists in Vienna because they said, well, we're just doing the same thing that they've been doing over and over again. But it was for a good reason. And if you go to Vienna and you've been to the Kunsthistorisches Museum, you know why. Because they gathered all the collections that were separated from the Habsburgs that had been in power for hundreds and hundreds of years into one collection. So going into this museum is kind of like going into the Louvre. Again, don't tell the French I said that. The Louvre, of course, is much bigger, but this one is astonishing. Okay? And so for this new building, now that he's in grace with the emperor, he also gets some commissions. This is Ecclesia, the figure of the church. He did Venice, he did Egypt, he did classical Greece, and so Clint, I watch too many alternative news. That's what we call a Freudian slip now that we're talking about Vienna. Anyways, this is to represent the Quattrocento, and I said I was going to behave. This is the Doge of Venice on one corner of the Kunsthistorisches. There we have Athena on one side, and then we have something representing the Egyptian civilizations. Once again, just to show you how classical Klimt was. He surely knew how to paint. So if you go to the Kunsthistorisches Museum and you're on the stairwell, don't forget to look for these Klimts. And some people pass them by without realizing where they are. Let's see. Now here's where he starts kicking it up a notch, like Emerald said, right? Judith and Holofernes. This is a story from the Bible. She was a Jewish princess. She was living in what is today modern day Israel, Judea. They were attacked, the Jewish people, by the Assyrians. And the general who was at this army was a general called Holofernes. And Holofernes, they were ravaging these villages throughout the land, and nobody was standing up to them. So Judith, who was his princess, said, well, the Jewish people should stand up to these guys. And so she had a maid, a chambermaid, that went with her. Her name was Abra. And she goes to the camp of the enemy. She's beautiful, she's stunning. Holofernes sees her. She plays with him, flirts with him, and tells him, look, why don't we do a little party? And he's thrilled. He goes into the tent, they make the dinner, and she feeds him liquor and liquor and liquor until he's propped out like me on a Friday night. And then she takes his sword and she chops his head off. One of the famous beheadings in history, and certainly in art, because everybody from Caravaggio on upwards has painted this beheading. The beheading of St. John the Baptist and the General Holofernes are both very famous. This is Klimt's version. She was later on, she was a widow. She had never, very beautiful. She was red-haired in the Testament. But here she puts her as a femme fatale. Lovely, but if you get too close, she's gonna like eat you up for breakfast. I have to tell you that his younger brother, who studied art with him, he used to do the frames. So that's how we have this kind of Art Nouveau style Judith and Holofernes and the decoration of the frame. I put a detail there. But this was shocking for the Vienna of that day. This is a woman that is way too sensual and way too dangerous, and he took liberties, very Byzantine, from Byzantine painting with the gold and all that, but very, very, very modern. This is Sigmund Freud before Sigmund Freud. This is the beginning of Klimt. Because the emperor was so impressed with him, he gets a really important job, which is the job that made him got him in trouble with the regime. Okay, the University of Vienna. That's another building that they decided to build and to make bigger. Okay, the University of Vienna. This picture was actually taken from the apartment where Beethoven used to live. But Vienna was the leading country in medical research in the world at the time. So it was very important, the university. And Klimt, he gets to paint 3 paintings. He gets to paint medicine, he gets to paint jurisprudence, the law, and he gets to paint philosophy. They're huge. They were like from here to that wall. And they were from the main entrance of the university, top-notch commission for Klimt. And so he has, I'm going to show you some of the drawings that from the sketches that start being made for these. We only have black and white pictures because they were destroyed, and I'll tell you that story a little bit later on. But this is philosophy. So he's gone bonkers. Now we have this like psychedelic, like an LSD experience with a kind of phantasmagoric image in the background, and then we have this flow of life. There's a man over there that is in deep despair. You know, it's not a pretty picture. And the guys from philosophy, they're not quite convinced. But you know, philosophy is philosophy. You know, it's fine. He's not well received there, but he will exhibit in the Paris exhibition of 1900, the World Fair, the World Exhibition in Paris. And he will actually get a medal for this painting in Paris. But in Vienna, they did not like it. And so there's a picture of the Eiffel Tower during the 1900 Paris exhibition. The people in Vienna, particularly at the government level, they start complaining. And the guy who was in charge of giving him the commission was the Minister of Education. And so he starts making the drawings for medicine. In this one, at the very bottom, we see Hygeia. Hygeia, this is where we get the word hygiene from. Hygeia, in Roman, she was a goddess of health, salud, where we get the word salud in Spanish. He starts making these sketches. Of very big paintings is going to take him several years. There we have Hygeia. This is the only color photograph that we have of her. Again, she was supposed to heal. Here she has a snake. She does not look like a woman you want to be anywhere near. They're not happy at all. One of the critics said, it is a phantasmagoria of half-dreaming humanity, sunk in instinctual semi-surrender, passive in the flow of fate. The doctors were not amused. They're the leading city for medicine, and this is not leading us to anything that kind of looks like a cure or preventive medicine. He also made a big no-no. You never showed pubic hair. You could put naked women such as nymphs and whatnot, that didn't matter, but this was a no-no. And so there's the girl, there's Hygeia, and then if you look on the top, there's a skeleton, and this is way, very, very modern for the time. We're talking about the turn of the century. They were really not pleased. They want to confiscate the studies for medicine. They take away his professorship. He was supposed to take these paintings to, I think it was Missouri, to a fair in Missouri in the United States. The Ministry of Education says we're not lending them, so the Americans are not going to see this trash. And finally, he manages to borrow money to buy them back from the state. He writes a letter to the Ministry of Education, and I'm just going to read you the letter. His Excellency Minister Dr. von Hartel has given me from his actions clearly to understand that my work has now become an embarrassment to those who commissioned it. If this task, which has consumed years of work, is ever to be completed, then I must seek to derive from it once again some satisfaction. And such satisfaction is totally lacking as long as, under the present circumstances, I must continue to regard it as a state commission. I am therefore faced with the impossibility of bringing this task, which is already so far advanced, to completion. And so, this is the end of Klimt with the state. Franz Joseph puts the black cross on him. right? He's written down in the Black Book, and he will make his living mainly from rich upper classes, particularly the Jewish classes. Just to make a long story short, the Minister of Education had to resign. They took away the possibility of him ever being a professor, and finally this very rich man acquired two of them, and an artist friend of his acquired the third. The last time they were shown in public was for a special exhibition that they did years after Klimt. They were exhibited in Vienna and Berlin. And then when, at the end of World War II, in 1945, they took the university paintings and they took a lot of Klimt paintings to a castle called Schloss Immendorf. And the retreating SS forces burned the castle. And we lost these university paintings, and we lost quite a lot of other Klimts in the process. But this was jurisprudence, the law. Now this is very psychedelic, right? It belongs more on the cover of a Led Zeppelin cover than in a university for law. We have the three gorgons from Greek mythology. We have these very abstract parts of it. We have a very, very old man there, weary in old age. We have this kind of like octopus with tentacles and all this. Klimt was very steadfast in that he was not going to change his vision. He was the artist that was going to bring Vienna into modernity against all odds. And this is why also he's so famous today. He made this painting called Nudas Veritas. And he writes, his brother does it in the frame there in metal, if you can't please everyone with your actions and your art, please a few. To please many is dangerous. Okay, so he's not giving in. Next, because he was so angry at not receiving the professorship, he makes this one and he titles it To My Critics. And his friends convince him in the end, look, you're playing with fire, you better change the name. So he named it Goldfish. And we do have kind of these goldfish. It's very nebulous, it's very, the girls are in this almost like water state with the hair floating. Very psychedelic. He's well on his way to this modern language that he developed. Let's talk a little bit about one of my favorite ladies, Pallas Athena or Athena. Athena was the goddess of wisdom. She was the goddess who helped the Greek heroes in war. Because she was the goddess of wisdom, she's often associated with jurisprudence. We see her a lot in places of the law or in parliament buildings and so forth. So that's her in the parliament building in front of the new parliament building that Franz Joseph had built in Vienna. And she always, because she helped the Greeks in battle, she always carries this little goddess in her hand on the orb, which is Nike, like the shoes, for victory, the goddess of victory. The Athenians used to put her on the bow of the important ships so that they could, when they went to battle against the Persians. So there is Athena. I'm going to talk a little bit about the secessions. The word secession comes from ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, if a group of people, quite a large group of people, were not happy with the laws that were being passed, they threatened the government. I'm about ready to do that with Washington right now. And they were 7 hills in Rome, and they said, well, we're going to go settle in another of the hills, and we're going to make our own city, and we'll compete with you guys, the Romans. And so the secession in art has always been when a group of artists forms a group called a secession, where you will no longer exhibit with the state, you will no longer accept money from the state, you will no longer be under the laws of the state, you will create your own organization. The first secession happened in Paris. The second one, the other two happened quite simultaneously in Berlin and in Munich. The guy who led the Munich secession and one of its founders was this man called Franz von Stuck. Franz von Stuck is very famous because he was the teacher of Kandinsky and of Paul Klee and of, who was the other one? Joseph Albers. Joseph Albers of the Bauhaus, who later came here and taught at Black Mountain College and at Yale, a very famous individual in the world of art. For the poster of the secession in Munich, he used Athena. Why? Because Athena, I forgot to mention to you, was also the goddess of the arts and crafts. She's our goddess. Mine is Dionysus, the god of wine, but she's a secondary goddess to me. And so the secession in Vienna gets founded in 1897. Klimt will be its first president. The other avant-garde artists, and I'm talking about visual artists, I'm talking about architects, I'm talking about designers, they all joined the secession with Gustav Klimt at its helm. Okay, and so we have the Vienna secession, which will now be financing its own shows and deciding what art will be shown, not Franz Joseph and his cronies. He made a magazine called Versacrum, Sacred Spring, this was one of the covers of the magazine. If you look at it, it looks like an album from the 60s. It's because the Art Nouveau of this time, both from Vienna and from England, greatly influenced the psychedelic art of the 60s. Okay? This could be like a poster for, I don't know. But anyways, so they found this magazine called Sacred Spring, and they will edit it for several years, and they will eventually get the money to build themselves a house. At first they will rent for their exhibition space. These are the logos of some of the most important people in the movement. Of course, we have Gustav Klimt there, we have Koloman Moser, Alfred Roller, we have Joseph Hoffmann, who was a very famous architect who gave us a lot of buildings in Vienna and Austria and throughout, and so forth. And so it's treated kind of like a company. And this is the first poster that Klimt will design for the Vienna secession for its exhibition. Okay? Now it is Theseus fighting the Minotaur. You remember that story. And we have Athena again. I recognize her because she has the Medusa, the Gorgon on her breastplate, or her, what do you call it, the shield, and her spear, and all that. Why? Because again, Athena will be a symbol, just like it was in Munich with von Stock's poster. She will be a, very classical, very old lady, but she will be the symbol of modernity because she's the goddess of the arts. But if you notice, Theseus, we can see his genitals. So he did not pass the censorship. And so he had to change it, and this is the new poster. He just put some roots in front of the genitals. Censorship. We're going to do that too. They also, because they do some shows, they have money for a new building. And Joseph Maria Olbrich, the great architect, will actually design this building. They had actually, the first show had taken place in the Horticultural Society. They had 57,000 visitors on the first day, and they sold 240 works. So they're starting to get recognized, but they need their own building. Klimt did this very quick drawing on a napkin of the secession building. Joseph Maria Olbrich, the architect who was his friend, changed it a little bit, but kept the bottom part. And so now they build themselves this jewel of a building called, this is the architect, Joseph Maria Olbrich, and this is Das Haus of the secession building. If you go to Vienna, in Karlplatz, you will see this jewel of a building called the secession building. There's a little Viennese coffee shop nearby called the Café Museum, where Klimt and Schiele and these guys used to go and have drinks and coffee. And so this is a picture from the opening of the secession building in 1898. And this is a picture of it as it is today. We have the three Gorgons there also. And if you see, it has a cupola that has it was a design that was very advanced for its age. And this building was actually destroyed, but it has been renewed. Not only has it been renewed, they have added gallery space upstairs and in the basement for contemporary shows. This is what the building looks like today. This is what the top looks like. He makes, at the same time as he made this poster, he makes this picture of Pallas Athena. Okay, again, his brother does the frame. He puts Athena there, and instead of putting Nike, she puts the naked girl, the red-haired girl that she had put in the goldfish, but she's holding up this little light or mirror there, so it was a little bit unconventional. Finally, I want to mention something with the Secession Building, which is Richard Wagner, the German composer. He had written a very important essay where he came up with this word called Gesamtumswerk, which means the total work of art, which meant for him, because it was the opera, that he felt like the opera had abandoned the all of the arts. So they were only paying attention to the singing. And he wrote in this essay that they had to pay attention to everything. The makeup was as important as the singing, the costume was as important as the singing, the set and the acting, very important for the opera, as important as the singing. So no art had priority over another. They were all the same, and they all worked for one thing only, the work as a whole. That's the concept very fast of Gesamtumswerk. And this is what these artists in Vienna were doing with this building. This is a concept that in this country Frank Lloyd Wright would use, because he would design a house, but the fork had to go with the handle of the bathtub and everything else alongside. You don't design just one thing, they all have to do with one another. I don't want to get too hooked on it, but it's kind of like a synthesis of all the arts. The English used to call it the socializing of the arts, because the metalsmith was not below the sculptor, and so forth. For the first exhibition that they do in this building, which was by then the 14th Secession exhibition, they decide that they're going to dedicate it to Ludwig van Beethoven, because they thought he embodied the universal artistic genius, even though he was not from Vienna. And so they will have this famous Secession exhibition in 1902. This is the poster that Alfred Roller did for this 14th Secession exhibition of Beethoven, and you see it says Klinger because they chose a painter, engraver, a sculptor called Max Klinger, and he will make this sculpture for the exhibition, a sculpture of Beethoven. Beethoven on a throne looking more like Zeus, the Olympian god, with the eagles on the side. And then the hallways and everything that was designed for this exhibition is around this statue of Beethoven. I forgot to mention that, just to go back real quick, they put there, they write, to each art its age, and to art its freedom. So they're saying, look, now we're free, we can do whatever we want, we don't need the government, we design our own things. In France they call it Art Nouveau. In Holland, in the Netherlands, they called it the Stil, and in Austria, they called it Jugendstil, or the youth style. Okay, and so all the artists will make something for this show, and Klimt, in one of the rooms, is going to make these very weird paintings. Now, while he's doing these, he's working on the university paintings, and he's having this fight with the government at the same time. And he gives us a mural where at the beginning, it's kind of like the beginning of the world for the Greeks, where the Titans fought with the monsters, and we have the Gorgon and his three daughters, one of them Medusa, and then this is the painting. So there we have one of the monsters. He will call it, the whole work, he will call it the Beethoven Frieze. If you go to Vienna and you visit the Secession House, you'll see how the Beethoven frieze is laid out exactly as Klimt had it back in the day in 1902. And so it's kind of strange. First we have the chaos of the world, we have the Gorgons, we have the evil, the typhoon, the monster, and then we have the Gorgon with his beautiful daughters, and then we have everything like poverty and sickness and death and all that. And then, now he copied the figure of the Gorgon from a very famous English artist, Art Nouveau artist called Aubrey Beardsley. I don't know if you've heard of Aubrey Beardsley. He died very young. He was part of what in Victorian times they called the degenerate artist. He designed Salome the play for Oscar Wilde. And so he copies from him. And we have this very Byzantine kind of psychedelic look. And from the monsters and the fight and the chaos and all these things that affect man, we have salvation. And it was in honor of the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. I sing terrible, but you know it. Da, 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 which has a very complicated chorus of about 100 people. Of course, it's very uplifting. It's a universal piece, if there ever was one in the history of art. And so we have a kind of these spirits, and then in the end, we have salvation. And salvation is kind of an English version. We have the knight in shining armor that comes. He comes to save the day, and the girls are there. He has these muses that are there with a harp, and and then there we go. Those are the muses that inspire the artist. And the theme is that through art we can reach salvation and love, and that is what really counts. So in the end, we have this chorus of girls kind of elevating themselves to the celestial heavens. We have this very psychedelic kind of flower theme, and we have the first kiss of Klimt. Salvation is through love, and so we have the couple kissing. And it was the artist didn't like it, the public didn't like it. He was in the midst of the university paintings, and he held steadfast. But anyways, that is the opening of the Secession Building. Who came to play at the opening? Gustav Mahler, the great Gustav Mahler, who was director of the Viennese Philharmonic there. Gustav had been painted by Klimt. That's also one of the Klimt paintings that he made. These are the SS forces as they're retreating, leaving Vienna during the war. They will set fire to the Secession Building. And the Secession Building will remain in ruins for many years. The first time that I saw it, it was like this, boarded up. And finally, the Viennese, in all their glory, decide to get the money, and they renew the building, and this is what it looks like today. It's beautiful. I just visited it this summer. We have galleries in the upper part. We have galleries in the basement and on the roof. There we have the new galleries added underneath when they built them. And we even have an Austrian stamp with the Secession Building on it. So it is one of the jewels of Vienna Jugendstil. If this wasn't enough, they decided to think of it kind of like a company. I don't want to call it like an enterprise. But the Secession did a lot of great projects. The founders of the Secession, the real leaders there, were Joseph Hoffman, the architect, and Koloman Moser, the painter and designer. You'll see a lot of Viennese workshop work in all the museums in Vienna. Joseph Hoffman looks like a guy that worked for Hitler in this one, but very menacing. And there's the great Koloman Moser, who also died the same year as Klimt, 1918. And they made all the furniture, the forks, the vases, dresses for the ladies, jewelry, you name it, they made it. Now, it was a concept kind of like the Bauhaus in Germany, which came a little bit later in 1919. But the difference between the Bauhaus and the British Arts and Crafts movement and the Viennese workshops is that the British Arts and Crafts movement, and particularly the Bauhaus, they wanted artists to design all kinds of things that would change the way we live through design and art, but it was to be mass-produced, not the Viennese workshops. Only the rich could afford it because it was handmade, it took a long time, each piece, and all that. Now this is Klimt's studio. The chairs were made this is Austrian Art Nouveau at its best. The chairs were made by the Viennese Secession, the different artists. And these furnishings were made by Koloman Moser, designed by him. Klimt, now I haven't talked about Klimt's sexual life. My mom told me not to talk about sex. But they say that Klimt, he never had any official kids, but they say he fathered a bunch of them. 14, I've heard. I'm not sure, don't quote me on that. He was a ladies' man, but he had a girlfriend, and he had this girlfriend for many years, and her name was Emily Flog. You'll see paintings of her. And Emily Flog worked also with the Viennese workshops. She had a fashion house with her sister, okay, in Vienna. The fashion house was called Casa Piccola. The sign is still up in Vienna, I saw it. And this is the card, the calling card that Klimt designed for Emily, his girlfriend. This is Emily. Now you have to remember, you ladies, you're coming into your own. Now you let go of the corset. You know, she was very avant-garde. She's having these dresses that are looser in the style of the Viennese Art Nouveau. And so that's Emily with one of the dresses. This is a Klimt in his garden, in the studio with Emily. He dressed kind of like a monk, always. And there's Emily, very fashionable. That's a kind of complicated fashion, right? Imagine wearing that in Miami. But it was called the Reform, this is the Fashion Salon 1910, also the Viennese workshops. This is a painting of Klimt of Emily Floge. So, you know, Klimt had been to Ravenna. You ever been to Ravenna with the mosaics? It's gorgeous, right? I mean, you got some of the best mosaics in the world in different churches in Ravenna, Italy, close to Venice. And he had also been to Venice. He had visited, what's it called, San Marco, the Basilica of San Marco. And he was very impressed with Byzantine art and all its decorations. And it's also where he got his inkling for the gold, the gilt of gold that he used, which is very expensive actually to use. These are cool. Now I told you that the Vienna workshops and the Viennese Art Nouveau and the English one greatly influenced the psychedelic era. These look like shoes that Ringo Starr would have worn in the Yellow Submarine, right? Pretty cool, I like them. The epitome of Gesamtum's work was designed by Joseph Hoffmann, and it was a palace built for a great sugar magnate whose name was Stocklet. And he practically gave them a blank check to build him a palace. And the palace was built in Belgium, in Brussels, today. It's not a museum because it's still owned by the Stocklet Palace, the Stocklet family, so it's closed to the public. But they had a field day. Everybody designed things for Stocklet Palace. And so this is some of the sculptures on the roof. Everything was designed specifically for this house by the Viennese workshops. This is the silver done by Koloman Moser. Nice, right? Yeah. This is a dining room for which Gustav Klimt made the mosaics. We have in the Museum of Arts and Crafts in Vienna, the Museum of Applied Art, I believe it's called, in Vienna, we have the drawings for these. But imagine your own private living room with mosaics done by Gustav Klimt. Here are the cartoons. One of it was almost abstract, okay? Here we have a lady, very oriental looking, very Egyptian too. And so he gets his cues from different civilizations. This was his studio. He had a collection of Japanese art and Chinese. There is the Tree of Life. And again, Athena always comes with the owl because she's the goddess of wisdom, and the owl has to do with wisdom. You'll see the owl outside the Secession building in Vienna, and here he puts it in the Tree of Life. And these are the drawings or the cartoons for this dining room of Mr. Stocklet. And it is there where we get the second kiss, right? Klimt's famous kiss. I just saw it in Vienna. I think it's at the Belvedere Palace, the Upper Belvedere in Vienna. that would be in the oil one. That would be the most famous painting of Gustav Klimt. But first of it, it comes out in the Beethoven frieze and then in the Stocklet dining room. And so there is the drawing for the Kiss, which is now in Vienna. He was very picky about the mosaics. I remember the lapis lazuli came from Chile, and he wanted it a little bit darker. He spent a lot of money back and forth with the mosaics being brought from different parts of the world. And this is the one that I just saw. It's like the Mona Lisa. You have people crowding around it with their cell phones wanting to take pictures of it. But it came from the Beethoven frieze, the man kissing the woman on this bed of flowers and so forth. And so let's talk about the most famous one. Now this one was not, I don't think, the best Klimt, but it definitely is the most famous one, and they made a movie from it. What is it called? The Woman in Gold. Okay? And the man behind all of this was a gentleman called Ronald Lauder. He owned, have you ever used Lauder products? Some of you ladies, I know you have. Ronald was in charge during the Clinton administration of organizing and creating an organization to try to retrieve stolen art. And Roland is Jewish, so he's concentrated on Jewish art. He loves Viennese art, so he has created a museum in New York, close to the Metropolitan, the Neue Gallery, and where he has all these great paintings. If you haven't been there, go on your next New York trip. But he made this portrait. This was a lady who was Jewish. She was married to a very rich magnate, not magnet. I'm from Venezuela, you have to have patience. And so she will actually be the only one that Klimt will paint twice, because her husband really loved Klimt. And ironically, she never really liked these paintings, but this is Adele Bloch-Bauer. And this painting was in the Austrian gallery in Vienna, belonged to the state. Now, let me give you the story. Adele, she got meningitis in 1925. She dies, and in her will, it wasn't very clear if she was leaving these paintings to the state or what. Mr. Bloch-Bauer, he had to flee Vienna during the war. He fled to Switzerland because he was Jewish. And in his testament, he leaves that he wants his nieces and nephews to have the painting. But the painting now, since the war, belongs to the Austrian state. This happens, this painting was painted in 1907, and this thing was called Altmann versus the Austrian state, because there was a lady by the last name of Altmann, the lady in the movie, and she was living in Los Angeles. She was 90-something, and Ronald takes care of the judicial side of it and convinces her, and they actually fight this for quite a few years, and in the end it goes to arbitration, and a Viennese judge rules in favor of Mrs. Altmann. He says, no, you get these paintings. So she got a few paintings from Gustav Klimt back. This one in particular, she sold to Ronald Lauder for $135 million. And it is the Mona Lisa of the New Gallery collection. I don't know if I pronounce it properly, I'm not Austrian, but anyways. The second one that he painted of Adele Bloch-Bauer, Mrs. Altmann, sold it at Christie's in 2006, same year, for $88 million. So I think she's doing okay with her little nest egg there. But a beautiful painting, I love this one. It meanders and it has beautiful color. How can you not like Gustav Klimt? Friedrich Maria Beer. She was actually a very cultured girl, very smart, and she actually had a great idea. She wanted to be painted by the three foremost Austrian artists when she was young. And she convinced Klimt to make a painting of her. She convinced Egon Schiele to paint a painting of her. And when she asked Oskar Kokoschka, he said no. Shame on him, because it would have been cool to have the same person painted by the three masters. But anyways, this is the Egon Schiele painting. We can talk about Egon Schiele another day. You'll see him plastered. I think he's also on the Paris Metro because he's going to travel to Paris, I believe, the Schiele show. But don't quote me on that. But there is Friedrich Maria Beer painted against the collection, the Asian collection of Gustav Klimt, and she's actually wearing a jacket that was made by the Viennese workshops that you could turn in and out. So it gave you two completely different designs. And they actually had a show in Paris a few years back that I saw, fabulous, and they had the clothes from the Viennese workshops, and they had this one, and it was great. But anyways, that is Gustav Klimt. Now, Emily Flog and her sister and the family, they summered in a lake called Attersee. If you've ever been to Austria, the lakes are gorgeous. And so they used to summer there in the lake. So we have quite a few paintings of Klimt and the lake. If you're going to lecture about Klimt, you have to show the lake paintings. They're almost abstract, absolutely beautiful. I'm going to show you the last picture taken in his studio. Okay, they're unfinished paintings. You can see one of them in Vienna. One is titled The Bride, the other one Lady with a Fan. One of them is Death of Life, and it received a first prize in the World Exposition in Rome. Now, Klimt, his mother dies in 1915. He was very close to his mom. And then in 1918, he suffers a stroke that is due to the Spanish influenza. It gets compounded by pneumonia from the influenza, and so he will die in 1918. 1918 is a crucial year because it's the end of the First World War. It's the end of Franz Joseph. It's the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's the end of the Ottoman Empire. Turkey becomes this tiny little country. Don't tell Erdogan that I said that. We lose the Romanovs to the communists in Russia in 1917, so the Romanov Empire also goes down the drain, and the whole map of Europe gets redrawn with even some new countries added in. So he's buried in Vienna, and you can see here in this painting, typical. Again, we have the lady like the goldfish. She's showing us her prettier parts. I don't know what to say. We're on TV. They're filming me. The death is involved. We have the same crouching kind of despair settling in, but all with the beautiful Klimt colors and that ornamentation so typical of Klimt. Klimt really pushed the envelope of modernity in Vienna. And let me just end the lecture real quick. A story that I just learned in Vienna. You know, minimalism is very much on the map. We have sculptors like Donald Judd here in the United States, who passed away a few years back, but he gave us the boxes that are just boxes. Okay? The 20th century, one of the things of the 20th century was that instead of giving us more is more, like the Art Nouveau or the Baroque, where you just pound decoration after decoration, the 20th century was about taking things away. And a very famous architect from Vienna called Adolf Loos wrote it in an essay called Ornament is a Crime at the beginning of the 20th century. And around this time, in front of the Hofburg Palace, where Franz Joseph was his favorite entrance, because the Hofburg Palace had several entrances, he built a house that if you visit Vienna, it's called the Loos House. And he gave us pretty much the house that we have today of the international style, which is just a block with windows, no ornaments. Okay, no balustrades, no columns, just a box with windows. And Franz Joseph stopped going through that entrance because he hated Adolf Loos's house so much. So Vienna really changed, and Gustav Klimt really changed the way that the Viennese saw art. He took it from this old pastiche Renaissance style into modernity. Today he's a classic. And let me just finish with a few pictures. This is the town of Attersee. I wouldn't mind retiring there and drinking Austrian wine. And because he painted there in the lake region, we have a statue devoted to Gustav Klimt. And then this is the town. And these are the paintings that he did. We can see there the building, and there we have the painting. Almost abstract, less is more, modern style. He used to summer here, and he was summering on the other side of the lake. And so he was on the bank with a telescope to see the other side to paint it. And that was how he painted it. I want to thank you very much for coming tonight, and I hope you have enjoyed it.